Story Corner, presented by Jennifer. The Cat Who. Book 1, The Cat Who Could Read Backwards. Chapter 3. Quillian, wearing the newer and darker of his two suits, went alone to the Valentine Ball at the art club, which, he discovered, was called the Turp and Chisel. The club had originated 40 years before in the back room of a blind pig. Now it occupied the top floor of the best hotel. Its membership was large and fashionable, and the impish bohemes who had founded the fraternity had become old, staid, and full of dollars. Upon his arrival at the ball, Quillian was able to wander unrecognized about the premises of the Turp and Chisel. He found a sumptuous lounge and dining room and a very busy bar. The games room, paneled with old barn wood, offered everything from darts to dominoes. In the ballroom, tables were draped with red and white cloths, and the orchestra played unconscious tunes. He had asked for Halpay's table, the Halpay table, and was greeted by Sandra Halpay wearing a white kimono of stiff embroidered silk. Exaggerated makeup made her almond eyes even more exotic. "I was afraid you wouldn't come," she said, holding his hand long after the handshake had ended, and delighted him with a rippled laughter. "The invitation was irresistible, Mrs. Halpay," said Quillian. Then he surprised himself by bending over her hand and brushing it with his mustache. "Please call me Sandy," she said. "Did you come alone? To a lover's ball?" "Yes, I represent Narcissus." Sandy trilled with merriment. "You newspaper men are so clever." She was lyrically tall and lovely, Quillian decided, and tonight she was charmingly relaxed. She was charmingly relaxed, as wives often were when their husbands are absent. "Cal is the chairman of the ball," she said, "and he's flitting around, so you can be my date." Her eyes were roguish as well as exotic. Then Sandy, exchanging into a formal tone that rang hollow, introduced the others who were seated at the table. They were members of Cal's committee, she explained pointedly. Mr. and Mrs. Riggs, or Biggs, were in French period costumes. A short, flashy couple named Birchwalter, who seemed to be having a dull time, were garbed as peasants. There was also May Sitter, art reporter from the other paper. Quillian gave her a fraternal bow, and at the same time estimated that she was 10 years past retirement age. May Sitter gave him a bony hand and said in a thin voice, "Your Mr. Mount Clemens is a very naughty boy, but you look like a nice young man." "Thank you," said Quill, "but no one has called me a young man for 20 years. "You'll like your new job," she predicted. "You'll meet lovely people." Sandy leaned closer to Quill and said, "You look so romantic in that mustache. I wanted Cal to grow one so he would look halfway grown up, but he resisted the suggestion. He looks like such an infant, don't you think?" She laughed musically. Quillian said, "It's true. He appears useful." "I think he's retarded somehow. In another few years, people will think he's my son. Won't that be crushing?" She gave Quillian an adoring look. "Are you going to ask me to dance? Cal is a terrible dancer. He thinks he's a killer, but he's really a clod on the dance floor." "Can you dance in that costume?" Sandy's stiff white kimono was bound about the middle with a wide black obi. More white silk was draped over her straight black hair. "Oh, sure." She squeezed Quillian's arm as they walked to the dance floor. "Do you know what my costume represents?" Quillian said no. "Cal is in a black kimono. We're the young lovers in a snowy landscape." "Who are they?" "Oh, you know, the famous print by Hiroshima." "I'm sorry, I'm a dunce when it comes to art." Quillian felt he could be a debonair about the admission because at the moment he was leading Sandy expertly through a foxtrot enhanced by a few of Quillian's flourish. "You're a fine dancer," she said. "It takes real coordination to foxtrot to a cha-cha, but we must do something about your art education. Would you like me to tutor you?" "I don't know if I could afford you on my salary," he said, and Sandy's laughter could be heard above the orchestra. "How about the little lady from the other newspaper? Is she an art expert?" "Her husband was a camouflage expert in World War I," said Sandy. "I guess that makes her an expert." "And who are the rest of the people at your table?" "Riggs is a sculptor. He does stringy emancipated things that are shown at the Lambeth Gallery. They look like grasshoppers." "So does Riggs, when you come to think of it. The other couple, the Birchwalters, are supposed to be Picasso's famous pair of lovers. You can't tell they're in costume. They're always dressed like peasants." Sandy turned up her nicely tilted nose. "I can't stand her. She thinks she's such an egghead. Her husband teaches at Penman School, and he's having a one-man show at the West Side Gallery. He's a vegetable, but he does lovely watercolors." Then she frowned. "I hope newspaper men aren't eggheads. When Cal told me to... Oh, well, never mind. I talk too much. Let's just dance." Quillian lost his partner shortly after, when a surly young man cut in. He was wearing a torn-up t-shirt and had the manners of a hoodlum. The face was unfamiliar. Later, back at the table, Sandy said, "That was Tom, our houseboy. He's supposed to be Stanley, what's his name, from the Tennessee William play? And his date is around here somewhere, dressed in a pink negligee. Tom is a bore, but Cal thinks he has talent, so he puts the kid through art school. Cal does a lot of wonderful things. You're going to write an article about him, aren't you?" "If I can collect enough material," said Quillian. "He's difficult to interview. Perhaps you could help me?" "I'd love to. Did you know Cal is the chairman of the State Council on Art? I think he wants to be the first professional artist to make it to the White House. He'll probably get there, too. He lets nothing stop him." She paused and became thoughtful. "You ought to write an article about the old man at the next table." "Who's he?" They call him Uncle Waldo. He's a retired butcher who paints animals. He never held a paintbrush until he was 69.
Where have I heard that before?
Quilliam said. Oh, sure, every senior citizen wants to be Grandma Moses, but Uncle Waldo is really talented, even if Georgie doesn't think so.
Who's Georgie?
You know Georgie, your precious art critic.
I haven't met the man yet. What's he like?
He's a real stinker, that's what he's like. When he reviewed Uncle Waldo's one-man show, he was absolutely cruel.
What did he say?
He said Uncle Waldo should go back to operating a meat market and leave the cows and bunny rabbits to the kids to draw them with more imagination and honesty. He said Uncle Waldo butchered more livestock on the canvas than he ever did in the meat business. Everyone was furious. Lots of people wrote letters to the editor, but the poor old man took it hard and stopped painting. It was a crime. He used to paint very charming primitives. I understand his grandson, who's a truck driver, went to the newspaper office and threatened to beat up George Bonfield McClemens, and I don't blame him. Your critic is completely irresponsible.
Has he ever reviewed your husband's work?
Quilliam asked with his best expression of innocence. Sandy shuddered. He'd written some vicious things about Cal. Just because Cal is a commercial artist and successful, McClemens classifies commercial artists with house painters and paper hangers. Actually, Cal can draw better than any of those Artie Bloch and Dipper kids who call themselves abstract expressionists. Not one of them could draw a glass of water. Sandy frowned and fell silent, and Quilliam said, "You're prettier when you smile." She obliged with a burst of laughter. "Look, isn't that a panic? Cal is dancing with Mark Anthony." Quilliam followed her pointing finger to the dance floor, where Cal Halplay in a black Japanese kimono was gliding a husky Roman warrior through a slow foxtrot. The face under Anthony's helmet was bold-featured but soft. "That's Butchie Bolton," said Sandy. "She teaches sculpture at the art school. Welds metal and all sorts of things. She and her roommate came as Anthony and Cleopatra. Isn't that a scream? Butchie weld her own armor. It looks like a couple of truck fenders."
Quilliam said the paper should have sent a photographer. We should be getting pictures of all of this.
Sandy did some acrobatics with her eyebrows and said, "Zoe Lambert was supposed to be handling publicity for the ball, but I guess she's only good for getting publicity for herself."
"I'm going to phone the picture desk," Quilliam said, "and see if they can send over a man."
Half an hour later, Odd Birdston, who was working the 1 to 11 shift, arrived with a 35mm reflex camera hanging around his neck and the usual cigar between his teeth. Quilliam met him in the foyer and said, "Be sure to get some good shots of Cal and Sandra Halpy." Odd said, "You're telling me. They love to get their noodles in the paper." "Try and get everybody in pairs. They're dressed up as famous lovers. Orthelia and Desdemona, Latoya and Hambo, Adam and Eve." "Crazy," said Odd Birdston as he readied his camera. "How long do you have to hang around here, Jim?" "Just long enough to see who wins the costume prize and phone something to the desk." "Why don't you meet me at the press club for a nightcap? I can quit after I print these." Back at the Halpay table, Sandy introduced Quilliam to an impressive woman in a beaded evening dress. "Mrs. Dirksby," Sandy exclaimed, "this is the most important collector in the city. You should write an article about her collection. It's 18th century England. Gangsforth and Reynolds, you know." Mrs. Duxbury said, "I'm not anxious to have my collection publicized, Mr. Quilliam, unless it will help you personally in your new position. Frankly, I am overjoyed to welcome you among us." Quilliam bowed. "Thank you. It is a completely new field for me." "I trust your presence here means that the Daily Fluxton has at last come to its senses and dropped Mount Clemens." "No," Quilliam said.
We're simply expanding our coverage. Mount Clemens will continue to write critical reviews. Oh, what a pity. We were all hoping the newspaper would dismiss that horrid man. The fanfare of trumpets from the stage announced the presentation of the costume prize, and Sandy said to Quill, I've got to collect Cal for the judging and the grand match. Are you sure you won't stay longer? I'm sorry, I have to file my copy, but don't forget, you're going to help me write a profile on your husband. I'll phone you and invite myself to lunch, said Sandy, giving the newsman an affectionate hug. It'll be fun. Quilliam moved to the back of the room and jotted down the names of the winners as the winners were announced. Then he looked for the telephone when a woman's voice, soft and low, said, Aren't you the man from the Fluxton? His mustache tingled. Women's voices sometimes affected him that way. This voice was like caressing fingers. I'm Zoe Lamberth, she said, and I'm afraid I failed miserably in my assignment. I was supposed to notify the paper about this ball, and it slipped my mind completely. I'm getting ready for a one-man show and working awfully hard. If you'll accept this a lame excuse, I hope you're not neglected. Are you getting all the information you need? I think so. Mrs. Halpley has been looking after me. Yes, I noticed, Zoe said with a slightly tightening of well-shaped lips. Mrs. Halpley was very helpful. Zoe's eyebrows flickered. I dare say. You're not in costume, Mrs. Lambert. No, my husband didn't care to come tonight. And I just dropped in for a few minutes. I wish you would visit the Lambert Gallery someday and meet my husband. Both of us would like to help you in any way we can. I'm going to need help. This is a brand new territory for me, Quilliam said. Then, shyly, he added, Mrs. Halpley has offered to supervise my art education. Oh, dear, Zoe said, with an tone that suggested mild distress. Don't you approve? Well, Sandra's not the most knowledgeable of authorities. Forgive me, sooner or later you'll find out that artists are notorious cats. Zoe's large brown eyes were being disarmingly frank, and Quilliam drowned in them momentarily. I'm really sincere in my concerns for you, she went on. I wouldn't want you misdirected. Much of the work being produced today is in the name of art is surplus at its worst and shoddy at its best. You should insist on knowing the credentials of your advisors. What would you suggest? Come and visit the Lambert Gallery, she urged, her eyes echoing the invitation. Quilliam pulled his waistline and entertained the idea of losing a few pounds. Beginning tomorrow. Then he made another attempt to find a telephone. The Grand March was over and the guests were circulating. Word had spread around the club that the Daily Fluxion's new reporter was attending the party, and he was easily recognized by his prominent mustache. Consequently, numerous strangers approached Quilliam and introduced themselves. Each one wished him well and followed with something uncomplimentary about George Bonafide Montclemens. Those who were art dealers added brief commercials for their galleries. Artists mentioned their forthcoming exhibitions. The layman invited Quilliam to come and see their private collection anytime, and to bring a photographer if he wished. Among those who had hailed the newsman was Cal Halpley. Come out to the house for dinner some evening, he said. Bring the whole family. Now the drinking commenced in earnest, and the party grew boisterous. The greatest commotion could be heard in the games room, and Quilliam followed the crowd in that direction. He found the room packed with laughing guests, standing rib to rib with barely enough room to raise a high ball glass. The center of the attention was Mark Anthony. She was standing on a chair,
Without her helmet, Mark Anthony was more nearly a woman, pudgy-faced with short-cut hair set in tight waves. "Step up, folks," she was barking. "Try your skill." Quillian squeezed into the room. The crowd, he discovered, was focusing its attention on a game of darts. Players were trying their aim at the life-size sketch of a man chalked on the barnwood door with all features of the anatomy expertly delineated. "Step right up, folks," the woman warrior was chanting. "Doesn't cost a cent. 1 chance apiece. Who wants to play Kill the Critic?" Quillian decided he had enough. His mustache was feeling vigorously uncomfortable. He made a discreet exit, telephoning his story to the paper, then joined Odd Bernstein at the press club. "Mount Clemens must be a pill," he said to the photographer. "Do you read his column?" "Who reads?" said Odd. "I just look at the pictures and check my credit line." He seems to have caused a lot of trouble. Do you know anything about the situation at the art museum?" "I know they got a cute chick in the check room," said Odd, "and some crazy nudes on the 2nd floor." "Interesting, but that's not what I mean. The museum just lost a $1 million grant from some foundation, and the director was fired as a result. That's what I heard at the party tonight. And they say the whole ruckus was caused by the Daily Function's critic. I wouldn't doubt it. He's always raising heck in the photo lab. He phones in and tells us what he wants photographed for his column. Then we have to go to the gallery and make the pick. You should see the garbage he expects us to photograph. Last week, I went to the Lambeth Gallery twice. I couldn't get a shot worth and I still couldn't get a shot worth printing." "How come?" The painting was black and navy. For Pete's sake, my print looked like a coal bin on a dark night. The boss thought it was all my fault. Old Monty always befiring about our photographs. If I ever get a chance, I'd like to bust a speed graphic over his skull."